I remember being cold, delirious, empty, drained. I'm still not sure if what followed me is due to that delirium continuing, or because I stumbled upon something or someone I should not have. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This all started about a decade ago. Around that time in spring when a winter chill still clings in the air. A group of energetic teenagers eating pizza from a hole-in-the-wall Italian restaurant. My brother and our friends all laughing and joking about the many stupid, mischievous things we did over the week of a spring break trip. We were interrupted by the buzz of my brother's phone with a ringtone. At the time, a black razor that showed it was our mother calling. His brows raising when he glanced at it, he excused himself from the table. I worried myself slightly as I finished my first slice of a different tasting pizza, wiping my mouth off from the grease. After some more chatting and joking, my brother tapped me on the shoulder, solemn, urgent look on his face as I excused myself now, and we went around the corner to speak in private. I looked worried as I breathed out, breath creating fog from the cold weather before I asked with a heavy tone, "What's wrong?" Our mother was in the hospital with our grandmother that whole week and the weekend, so I was nervous, but not coming to any conclusions before I heard anything certain. He wiped some condensation from his peach fuzz beard, as his eyes were slightly red. I feared the news he was going to tell me. He said in an equally heavy tone, "Mom just called. Grandma's gone. We're getting on a flight to O'Hare tomorrow morning." I was taken aback. No words. We just embraced, patting each other's backs in a rare moment between brothers who normally bickered to one another. We went back to the table and apologized to our collective friends, telling them the news while we finished our meals, the tone becoming much more somber, but our friends did their best to cheer us up with some solidarity. My stomach lurched, but at the time I figured it must be from the heavy news. I still finished my pizza all the same, teenage athlete appetite taking over. We made our way back to our hotel, winding down and packing our bags, our friends going home, us to the airport, our bodies tired, but I soon felt incredibly cold. I began to stare at the ceiling. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not, because my stomach was beginning to loop and jump around. Shadows danced across the ceiling. I didn't know what time it was, and I wasn't sure if it was from the headlights of cars or people. But they seemed to be making me nauseous, not calmer. As my stomach gave a familiar lurch once more, a feeling starting to rise up in my throat. I snapped up and rushed to the bathroom, the door handle not turning. I didn't know what time it was or if I was having a dream, but I knew I needed in there. My hand desperately trying to turn the handle as my throat muscles struggled to hold down the wave coming. It was one of my brother's friends who finally chimed in. I finally saw the crack of light beneath the door indicating he was in there as he said, "Bro, I'm taking a shit, chill." I couldn't wait. "Fuck me," I muttered. I didn't want it stinking up the trash can all night, so I rushed out into the hall, hand covering my mouth, trying best to hold it in. But to no avail. I'm sad to say the first wave didn't make it to the toilet. If I could find the poor house cleaner who had to clean that up and personally apologize, I would. But nonetheless, my throat burned from the I don't remember how many waves it was, but I know my stomach was empty. I shambled back to the room after cleaning my hand and rinsing off whatever needed rinsing and brushed the stink and burn of stomach acid in my mouth. I crashed to sleep, and I barely remember any of the following morning, only telling my brother I threw up. He was certainly worried, even more so when I threw up the apple I tried to eat on the side of the transport van. That part I do remember. I don't remember getting through security, and certainly not the airplane ride. But I remember my mother's worried face as she cupped my cheeks, exclaiming, "Honey, what's wrong?" My brother flatly saying, "I think he's got food poisoning." My mom ushered me to the rental van and laid me down as we drove. I definitely didn't remember the Chicago suburbs. But as my stomach started to yearn for something resembling food, I don't remember when, but I remember my brother handing me 2 cups. One, I could feel the frozen slurry of a milkshake that I greedily sucked down, chased only by a fizzy plain soda. It certainly began to make me feel mildly better, and I was certainly done sleeping for at least the time being. My mother urging me to stay awake for the funeral home. I looked out the window, seeing the town she grew up in. A very tired, crumbling town. A few buildings being hollowed, dark shells. The people walking down the streets tired, gray shadows that just seemed to be trying to get to the next day. The funeral home reflecting this feeling very much so. The wallpaper on the halls starting to peel at the top or had moisture stains. The baseboard having cracked paint. The rugs still probably being from the 80s or 90s. Just old, tattered homemade lace adorning all the dressers that had pictures of our grandmother and our family. Not that anyone would ever be thrilled to enter a funeral home, but the tired atmosphere matching such a tired town made things all the worse. I approached the only new thing in the room, grandmother's casket. The expression on her face, one of peace and calm, hands over her chest, but her skin rumpled in such a way that one could tell she was pumped with formaldehyde to make her look as if she was asleep for the service, if the smell from her wasn't enough. But I put that aside, grasping the brass handles on the coffin, holding my mother's hand as we said our goodbyes. But soon enough, that milkshake and soda had finally made their way through. I began looking for the bathroom in a bit of a hurry. I exclaimed under my breath, "Why don't they put signs up?" Not helping that every door was exactly the same down to the round knob. I came to one at the end of the hall, thinking that must be it. No sooner had I turned the handle and opened the door, I was hit in the face with a wall of cold. The room being far bigger than I expected, and aside from the cold, a pervasive darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see what was in the room. Racks with human-sized black sacks. I was in the body storage room for those still arranging a funeral. I already had had enough of this room. I was trying to tell myself to turn around, but I was frozen as my eyes still scanned and took in the room. My mind still telling me to just turn around, leave. Then I heard breathing. It was already bad enough that I didn't feel alone in that room, but I heard a heavy, ominous breathing from one of the bags in the center of the room. I could faintly make out a head still protruding from the bag. And then to my horror, I saw breath coming from the mouth. I still couldn't move, frozen stiff as the head began turning. The face at first was sheer darkness, no features. Then it opened its eyes. Those horrible eyes. Eyes is still being generous. They were as if a 2-year-old had erased 2 circles on a completely scribbled page. Just whiteness. I could feel my arm hairs standing on end as a shiver ran down my spine. "Move!" my mind said. "Move already!" All I had to do was turn around and close the door, but I couldn't. That ungodly stare and breathing keeping me locked in place. What finally made my body move was its smile. Yes, it fucking smiled. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at, but it sure as hell wasn't human. Its mouth smiled. Rows of sharp, jagged, yellowed, pointed teeth. A long, forked tongue protruding out from it. The moment I heard a crack from it beginning to move its neck at all was the moment my brain finally connected to my legs, and I turned around, slamming the door behind me and running out into the thin hallways of that funeral home once again, desperately power walking, doing my best not to piss my pants as I turned a corner and looked around where I came from. Nothing. I rose my brow as I then turned to keep looking on the other end of the hallway, and no sooner had I turned, a tall man was standing there. Now, I'm not short by any means. This didn't happen while I was a young boy. This happened whilst I was a nearly fully grown teenager. But the man that stood before me had to be nearly 7 feet tall, his hair nearly touching the ceiling. But it wasn't just that. His eyes looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Sunken, black around every crevice. He had to be at least over 70. And it wasn't just that. His manner of speaking was off as well. He said plainly and bluntly, "Why are you running?" I said with a clear nervousness in my voice as I looked back, "Bathroom?" He simply looked ahead with a "this way." He led me to the other end of the hall with finally a unisex bathroom sign. I sighed with relief as I entered, but I remembered I should thank him. But no sooner had I turned around, he was gone. I didn't think about it much as I finally relieved myself, thought about what I saw still fresh in my mind, but doing my best to put it aside, once again chalking it up to that delirium from food poisoning. No sooner had I gotten out of the bathroom, I heard raised voices in a pitched argument. I went back to the main hall with Grandma's casket and saw my mother in something of a 3-way argument with my wheelchair-bound great aunt and an elderly man I didn't recognize. But the only way I can describe him is looking like my brother would in his old age. I had no context for the argument, so I sat to the side until all three left each other in a bit of a huff. I was tempted to ask what that was about, but usually when my mother is upset, asking that of her usually meant being snapped at. But as my mother sat down, pinching the bridge of her nose, face flushed, eyes still watering, I gingerly asked, "Well, what was all that about?" She rubbed my back and said, "A lot of stuff that you don't need to worry about, sweetie. Just know after this weekend, we'll probably never be in Graham's house again." I frowned. I had no experience in these affairs, but I could only assume my mother was being muscled out of something in the will. Something that was more emotional for her than monetary. As much as I loved my grandmother and her house had warm memories, never being in her home again was something I would surely miss, but something I would have to adjust to. But I didn't know who the man she was arguing with. So at risk of another snapping, I asked, "And who was that other guy? I don't think my memory is going yet, but I don't remember him." My mother looked solemnly at Graham in the casket and said plainly, "He is the reason I went to go live with Graham. And that's all you need to know." I didn't prod further, but I quickly surmised that was my grandfather. I remember stories of her being raised by Graham, but she never truly elaborated much why, and I figured I'd find out more when she was ready. At that same moment, my brother sat on her other side, seeing her starting to tear up heavily. She began breaking down and said, "She was so damn strong." My brother and I instinctively put our arms around her in an embrace. She held our arms as she sobbed, feeling as though we were all she had left. Soon after a slight potluck where I was still fearful about what I could eat, I slowly nibbled on crackers and nothing else, as we tried to speak of happier times before we left for our grandmother's home. A place that was often filled with a soft merriment through whichever season we visited. I never would and will forget this home and every room in it. Although my head was much closer to the ceiling now, I certainly still wasn't feeling my normal amount of energy as I went upstairs to lay down to rest further, in a bed I now barely fit in. My mother bringing me a ginger ale I didn't even drink half of before I dozed off again. I once again had the urge to go to the bathroom. Hours later, as I was awoken by a familiar train blare. I often heard this sound in my youth, late at night as the train passed through town. It was distant enough to be soft, but close enough to where you knew its horn when it blared out. My feet creaked under the old floorboards as I went to wash my face, almost not recognizing myself, pale still, gaunt from lack of food. On that note, my stomach growled, and while I was skeptical, I wanted to at least try to eat something. I made the sandwich to end all sandwiches, piled high with refined deli meats from the potluck, some of the sharp cheddar, and then slathered in mayo. I ate it greedily as I checked my own flip phone to see what time it was. 11 p.m. at night. Light snoring from my mother as she slept in our Graham's old bed. I couldn't find myself going back to sleep. I had slept enough, and the sandwich would surely only give me more energy. There was something about this peace at night in this home. Once again, that peace interrupted by a sound. A few notes being played on Graham's old piano. High notes. My heart sank. Was I being delusional again? Hallucinating? I sauntered into the living room with the piano, cheek full of my last bite of sandwich as I chewed. The odd thing being, the notes stopped the moment I entered. I looked around, my eyes landed on Graham's old lace drapes, likely once a dark blue, now a faded baby blue that you could see through. And what I saw was a figure in a white robe, letting off a faint glow almost. Every fiber in my body told me to go back upstairs and go play on my old gray block Game Boy until I could fall asleep again. But I remembered no game light, and I scratched the back of my head and figured a light walk would help me digest, and I could prove to myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. So I quickly snagged my coat off the chair, still in my long PJs, as I slipped on my shoes without socks and went outside in the slight bite of the late night cold. Scant street lights lighting up the streets, but still enough starlight and moonlight. I walked around the block in the opposite direction. The only thing that could confirm my suspicions for sure would be if what I saw was still there by the time I made my way back around. While the neighborhood was tired as well, halfway through spring just about, and Christmas decorations still hung from neighbors too old and tired to come out and take them down. Nice memories flowing into my mind as I looked at the vast amounts of grassy yards between the homes, the old workshop that belonged to my family, but realistically the whole neighborhood used, remembering everything covered in snow as we made snow forts for snowball fights, smile spreading across my face as I walked, hands in pockets. But I soon had a strange feeling. It was incredibly quiet that night, with the occasional chirp from a cricket. Everyone in the whole neighborhood had to be asleep except me. My eyes darted about, a feeling of being followed coming over me. I looked behind. Nothing. But as I looked in front of me and came back around to Graham's, I saw a strange figure, an entity that almost looked like my mother, but different. She was wearing a pure white robe that flowed in the night breeze, But no sooner had I laid my eyes on her, she disappeared. I rubbed my eyes. I couldn't believe how many strange experiences I was having in one day. And to keep this in mind, I never had experiences like this before, here or anywhere else. But as soon as I saw her, I heard the breathing again. I knew it all too well. I thought to myself it was impossible. My mind raced several different questions in my head. What is this thing? Aren't these things bound to the building they're part of? Am I still delirious? Why me? But as I asked these questions, I slowly and trepidatiously turned around as I saw its eyes again. As the streetlights suddenly went out, except for the one that showed the shadow of the tree it was standing in. Once again, its pure white lights very, very visible. Once again, its smile spread across its face as the tongue flicked in and out. It still looked human in shape, but it looked like it was made of the shadow it was standing in. It placed a hand on the ground, breathing still, its hand stretched, almost as if a shadow were to stretch, and they came towards me. This time, with more energy coming and no feeling like vomit coming, my fight or flight response acting a little quicker. I turned and ran back towards the house at a full sprint, quickly closing the door behind me, catching my breath. I must have been breathing insanely fast. I didn't know how long I waited there before I turned and looked out the window of the door for anything that might be following me. Nothing. Nothing at all. I took a big breath as I sat at the table and ran my hands through my hair. Once again, all those same questions racked my brain. I was beginning to wonder if I was still asleep and this was all a dream. But a mild sweat formed on my brow. And something I hadn't realized. I never got a chance to shower. And I figured the hot water to wash off the sweat would be perfect to help me fall asleep. I soon laid back down in my bed. My brother effectively dead to the world in terms of sleep, as I stared at the stucco ceiling, counting the spots on it until I drifted off again. The following morning, the funeral service went off largely without a hitch. I saw no spirits, not that I was entirely sure I truly saw any yesterday either. The priest sang the final rites as we watched Graham descend into the ground. A strange fear overtaking me. I've always been afraid of being buried alive. I know I'll probably never cross the wrong people to make that happen, but it's still a fear I can never shake. But only matched by an anxiety as we had to go to the lawyer's office. Once again, a discussion very much for my mother. Graham likely knew my brother and I weren't old enough or immediate enough to inherit much outside of money, but we knew the negotiations would be intense for my mother, so we wanted to be there for her. And sure enough, they were. No sooner had the lawyer finished the reading, once again, intense arguments broke out over the interpretation of Graham's last will and testament. That would be enough to handle, were it not for how my grandfather spoke to my mother. The way he spoke to her was if he was speaking to not only someone unrelated to him, but someone he was barely even willing to treat as human. I don't remember what it was he said, but it was enough for me to leave the room, and make a show of it. Rather than jump halfway across the room and throttle him, this man I'd never met and only knew him by his mistreatment of my mother, I wrung my fingers to try and rid myself of that temptation as I walked down the halls of the decently sized office space we were in, which was probably the only big and new building in the whole town. Oddly enough, despite being enraged, I felt a sense of security. I decided to go wait in the car, going into the small underground parking garage there, when suddenly, every single light in that garage flickered off. I said to myself, "Oh, you're kidding me." Then, there it was again. That breathing. This time, closer. More intense and rapid pace. This time, it appeared in the only light in the whole garage. A dull, yellow emergency light blocking the only other exit out. It looked bigger this time. The last 2 times it looked human, but now it was starting to misshape into something I've never seen before. Its limbs long and gangled, its hands now fully claws, as it set them in the scant amount of light. Once again, its eyes wide, unblinking, looking right at me. This time, that forked tongue licked the sharp teeth. This time, I was more ready to react as its body left the light. It left the light and came towards me. This time, my reaction was instant, as I turned and sprinted to the door I came from, instinct and what I could remember guiding me in the darkness, feet slamming against the pavement. I prayed my shoelaces didn't come undone right now as I sprinted for the door. I saw the faint line of light outline as I smelled what was behind me. The pungent, thick smell of rotting meat, as I felt the breathing was right behind me now. I quickly slammed the door as it flew open and I sprinted down the hall, sunlight from the windows peeking in, the smell getting farther away as I kept running, but slower until I stopped, breathing heavily as I slapped my hands to my knees. As soon as I stood, my mother approached me with a, "Honey, what's wrong? Did you throw up again?" I shook my head with a, "No, I wanted to blow off some steam. I really didn't appreciate the way that, well, Grandpa was talking to you, and I had to leave." She nodded and said, "I understand. You think 13 minutes with him was bad? Try 13 years. She let out a titter of a laugh, as I had a resigned look on my face, and she seemed to as well. My only guess was that the negotiations over the will didn't go well at all. It was frustrating, as I know how much work my mom put into Graham's house, as well as taking care of her in her final days. Sadly, there was nothing my brother or I could do to help, outside of comforting her as best we could. We had a dinner at a more reliable pizza place we had been to several times as children. We tried to cheer up and move on. I told my mom that it was the best thing to do and her life wasn't here anymore. It seemed like she agreed, albeit reluctantly. We returned to Graham's house just one final time. One last look at those tired but pleasant walls, the smell of cough drops and air fresheners as we all sat on the couch and talked of more pleasant times. My mom finally recounting the events that led her to stay with Graham. I asked her finally, what drove Grandpa to be like that? She, feeling much better, nodded as she bit her lips slightly and said, "I don't know, frankly. I don't remember his father being like that. If he was, then it's just something that follows, I suppose." I swallowed, feeling the presence of the thing that I had seen thrice already, but trying to push it out of my mind. I followed that with a, "Well, what do you mean?" just to keep my mind off it. She said as she shook her head, "Well, I don't know. It just seems like something that began with Cain and Abel and has not really stopped, so much as it has been watered down." I shuddered at that thought. If this is watered down, it's no wonder history looks how it does. We embraced our mother as she let out one more soft cry, before we retired to those old beds one last time. However, when I awoke, it wasn't morning. It didn't feel like night either. The house was pitch black. My eyes adjusted as I saw an old lantern, like an old tin oil lamp, on the dresser near the foot of my small bed there. Something was off. Not any amount of starlight or moonlight from the windows. And there was a fog on the floor. A dense fog. And everything was without odor or sound. The floorboards not creaking at all. Although there was one sound, seemingly coming from down below. There was one room in this house I dreaded going. I didn't know if I was still awake or dreaming, but I had a feeling I couldn't leave until I confronted what was following me. I took the lantern and lit it with an echoing creak, lighting up the room, and strangely enough, my brother and mother weren't in their beds as I looked about the house. As I made my way downstairs, stairs still not creaking their usual creak, I once again saw the white figure. This time, she was at the piano, playing the notes I heard the previous night, as she then faded away once again, before pointing to the basement, which from it was the only other light source. An ominous red glow, like fire in the distance of a dark forest. I held the lantern up and approached. I could feel my heart in my throat, but I certainly wasn't about to throw up again. I rounded the stairs, the red light getting brighter, and soon I approached the basement door. During the daytime, it was ominous as it was, even worse at night. I never went in there at night. But now it was outright dreadful as I approached it. A mark that I now recognize on the door as I opened it and saw where the red light was coming from. Several red candles glowing around the room, and in the corner, that awful, horrible breathing. The pungent smell of rotting meat filling my nostrils again. Its shape was never more clear. No shadows to hide its form. The thing was still made of nothing but darkness, but as it turned, cracking noises as it turned its head, all the way around. This time, its smile was wide and impossible. It now had two pupils, two thin black slits between the white circles. Tongue still flicking. As it turned the rest of its body around, cracking sounds like dry twigs. As I could see more definition on its body, more markings protruding from shadowy flesh, as it now began laughing. Approaching me, I knew there was nowhere to run, and I'm not going to hide to wait for this thing. Dream or not, I had to stand my ground. I finally had to fight. I grit my teeth and gripped the lantern as I let out a loud, "Leave me alone!" Throwing the lantern at it, and in a bright flash, I woke up. My brother standing over me as he said, "Whoa, I am. What's wrong?" I breathed heavily as I looked around. It was morning. He continued, "Bro, come on, get up and get ready. We gotta get in the car and catch our flight back home." I stared at my feet for a moment as he said, "You okay, bro?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, just a weird dream." I got up, and once again our trip and flight home was relatively calm and uneventful. Soon arriving that night, and there were so many streetlights even as I ran. I never felt so safe being in my own home. The next few nights came and went uneventfully, my body getting back to normal, and even on late night runs, still no sign of that thing. I think I did it. But, as I said, it still follows me, and I saw it again one night. as I slipped into bed and turned off my reading light and heard the breathing, smelling that horrible putrid smell. As I looked to the end of the bed, I shook under the covers, gripping the blanket as I said, What do you want?" It let out in a guttural voice. "I never leave." Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to this story. It was a hard one to work on. Once again, this was one I wrote myself. It's interesting to write and then narrate a story. If you liked it, click that like button. Click the subscribe button as well. Don't forget to visit our social media links. If you have extra money, go ahead and donate to us on Patreon. I understand these are hard times, but once again, if you just share the video, that helps us out immensely. Happy Halloween, guys. I hope you're having a good one so far. And there is one more story to do. We have one more coming, and it should be ready on Halloween night. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you later.